back. So another cool feature of the Unreal Engine is that physics simulation is built in. It's a part of the engine naturally. So while we were away, I took the time to bring in this wardrobe from the Edith Finch library in this cardboard box. The cardboard box is set on the top of the wardrobe with the intent that it should fall off as we get close so that we can see that it's something that we can move around and kind of push through the room. So if I press play now with it set up the way that it is, it's just going to sit there and it's on top of the box. Even if I run into it, nothing happens, and that's because physics isn't activated for it by default. To make sure that physics is active for an object, first thing you need to do is make sure that that object has a collider. So if we select our object, so if I go to my content, EFED, and I go into my meshes, I can find my cardboard box in here, and our colliders are stored as part of our mesh data in Unreal. So I can double click to open that mesh, and if I select it, I'll see that there's a yellow box around it. It's a little hard to see. So that yellow box is the collider that's attached to this box by default. If it did not have one, I could go up to collision and I could add a box simplified collision. There are additional ways that you can add collision. To find more about that, go ahead and check out the Unreal website, as it's beyond the scope of this class. But you can add, for example, multiple collision boxes so that you can make them in the shape that you want them to be. You can create custom collision meshes. There's lots of information out there for how you can improve your collisions. But for the purposes of this class, we're only going to worry about putting a box collision around something to give it that sort of box shape and allow the physics to apply to it. Since that's set up, I can go ahead and close this browser that's already set, and I can select my box in the world. And to turn on our physics, we're going to look for the physics header inside of our details, and we can just activate simulate physics. So any object that has a collider, physics are on and it automatically falls, and physics will be applied. Right now, my box was balanced on the edge so that it would fall off, and I can now push it around the room to do things that I need to do. But what if I didn't want that box to fall until I knew that the player was close enough to see it? Well, what I would need to do is I would want to turn the physics off by default. So I'm going to turn off that checkbox. And then we're going to add a trigger that when the player enters that trigger, we're going to activate the physics of that box. We're going to turn the physics on. So to do that, I'm going to add my trigger to the world. So here's my trigger box. I'm going to make my trigger box nice and big using my scale tool because I'm definitely going to want to be able to activate this trigger in a large area as I get close. So here's my large trigger box. Then I'm going to move into position. So if I get anywhere near this object inside of my game world, I'm going to activate physics and it's going to go ahead and fall. So let me continue to expand this to make my trigger nice and big. All right. So there's my trigger box. If I get close to this object, I'm going to activate physics and we're going to make it fall. So I'm going to take my trigger box that I've just created, that I'm going to be able to enter and overlap with, and I'm going to turn it into a blueprint. To do that, as always, we select our object, we click the little button to turn it into a blueprint. I'm going to give mine the name BP Box Physics Trigger, and I'm going to make sure that it's in my blueprints folder. Now that I have my blueprint, I can go into my event graph and we can start changing things as we begin our overlap. So I'm going to add a variable that's going to be for the object that I'm going to activate the physics for. Now, as we said, activating the physics is kind of built into the static mesh itself. So I'm going to need to be able to get to the static mesh component. To get to the static mesh component, I'm going to need a static mesh actor. So I'm going to create a variable. I'm going to call this actor. My type is going to be static mesh actor. So here's my static mesh actor, object reference. I'm going to expose it so we can set it inside of the editor. And I'm going to bring that actor into my blueprint. With that actor set up here, I'm going to be able to come off of it. And I need to get the static mesh component. So the static mesh component is what's going to actually have physics on it. This is where I'm going to be able to interact with physics. So here's where I can set simulate physics. And what we can do is we can say at the start, when this object first exists, we'll turn our simulate off. When I bring this down and we set simulate physics again, whenever I enter the trigger, I'm going to set my physics to on. So now whenever I enter that trigger, it'll activate physics and my box will become a physics object that I can move around in the world. But at the start, it's not going to have physics attached to it. So save, compile, close my blueprint. Now I can select my trigger box, and inside of my default, there's the actor. I'm going to choose it, and I'm going to choose my cardboard box. With my cardboard box set, I'm going to double check just to be sure that my cardboard box is set to movable. Some objects will also be set to static by default, in which case physics won't allow me to move them. I have to make sure that they're set to movable. Now that that's set, I can press play. There's my object. It hasn't fallen yet because physics aren't enabled. But as I move to get close, I enter the field. Physics is enabled and my box falls down. I'm going to go ahead and show the next thing that we can do with physics. We're going to add a little force to it. So we're going to actually push the box when we enter the trigger. To add this force, I'm going to need to start to look and think, what direction do I want to add this force in? I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add it along the y-axis, which is this green. And I'm going to add it on the z, which is up. So I'm going to add y and z, and I'm going to kind of push it a little bit in that upward and to the side. So I'm going to open up my trigger again. So let's open up our box trigger. And now, in addition to turning on the physics, I'm going to also come off that object, and I'm going to add some physical force. One type of force is called impulse. Adding impulse force is like an explosion or pushing the object, and I'm going to add impulse at a given location. So here's add impulse at location, and the impulse force that I'm going to add is I'm going to add quite a bit on that y. So there's 1,000 and a little bit on my up. So maybe like 250. Let's see if that's enough. I will save, compile, and we'll go ahead and give this a shot. So let me hook it up so that it actually runs. And now we should see it move a little bit better and be a little more likely to fall off. So I start, right? I'm moving around. I move into my trigger. Boom. And my box falls. So that's the way that we can use Blueprint to set up actions that cause physics to be enabled so that now I can push this box around through the world just by moving into it. But it doesn't start in the enabled format, so it starts with it being disabled. And then I can enable that physics when I enter an area. If enabling the physics isn't enough, I can add force using add impulse at location. So if you want to think about having a rock slide cause a bunch of rocks to fall down and block the player's path, you could turn on physics for those rocks so that they slide and fall down in a very interesting way. And then once you finish that, so either using a delay node or using a timeline node, you can turn off the physics for those rocks. And now they're not able to be pushed around by the player. They're stuck in place, but the place they are is now blocking that hallway. So if you want to have your player try to go down a hallway and then have a location trigger, activate, turn on the physics that causes rocks to fall down and fill the hallway, it creates particle effects that look like smoke and dust that fills that hallway as well. And then turn off the physics for those rocks so the player can't push them out of the way, you can effectively block that path and force your player to take a different route in a very interesting way. So you can set up these really cool events that change the way that your player moves through the level.